We're really delighted to have such a tremendous response to this conference. It was launched last night with a wonderful event with General Romeo Dallaire, and he plans to join the proceedings today as well, so we'll look forward to welcoming him later on today. I also want to thank our co-sponsors. We've had tremendous cooperation from Human Rights Watch, the Genocide Intervention Network, and a number of other organizational co-sponsors and campus partners who are all listed in your program. We're honored to have Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost George Breslauer open today's event. Provost Breslauer is a political scientist specializing in Russia. He has been a faculty member at UC Berkeley for 35 years and became Provost last summer. So please join me in welcoming Provost Breslauer.
Thank you, Camille. Chancellor Bergenot would have eagerly welcomed you here today, were it not for the fact that he had to be in Los Angeles for the meeting of the UC Regents. But I do bring to you his greetings, as well as my own. I want to also salute the Human Rights Center and its leadership under Eric Stover for the phenomenal work it has done all these years. And this is an example of the type of work it has done. I'd like to say a few words about the topic of today's conference. The responsibility to protect populations from genocide and atrocity crimes is an international commitment by governments to prevent and react to grave crises wherever they may occur. In 2005, world leaders agreed for the first time that states have a primary responsibility to protect their own populations and that the international community has a responsibility to act when these governments fail to protect the most vulnerable among us. The responsibility to protect means that no state can hide behind the concept of sovereignty while it conducts or permits widespread harm to its population. Today's conference is the first on the West Coast devoted to exploring the responsibility to protect, or R2P as it is known, and to advancing plans for its implementation. In addition to the university's role as creator and disseminator of knowledge, the Academy can also serve as convener, a role this conference aims to fulfill. We are honored to host a high-level gathering of top thinkers, political representatives, and human rights leaders to address this urgent topic. Last night, you heard about one of the most glaring cases when the international community failed to protect a vulnerable population. General Dallaire's task during the 1994 genocide in Rwanda would have been helped immeasurably had such a framework for international intervention been in place. The United Nations would have been equipped with policies, if not resources, to respond to the dire situation, and the U.S. might have shown more political will to intervene if the grassroots support that we currently see for stopping the genocide in Darfur had been developed in that instance. Despite global advances in technology, commerce, and communications, it is surprising and shameful that genocide continues to be a tool of terror and repression at the beginning of the 21st century. The wholesale destruction of human life, whether through active aggression or neglect, demands attention from the international community. The responsibility to protect equips governments and international agencies with tools not only to react to genocide after the fact, but also to develop a range of interventions that would protect citizens before mass atrocities have been committed. Of course, moving from a sweeping idea to its effective implementation can be a long road. This conference is a stop along the way. It follows a gathering held in Chicago last year, and additional conferences are planned for Europe and New York over the next several months. With each meeting, leaders move closer to realizing the goals of R2P and mobilizing important constituencies to lobby for its support. UC Berkeley is a fitting site for such a conference, given the university's long tradition of student activism and commitment to social justice. Indeed, it was due in part to the students' engagement on Darfur that the Human Rights Center was motivated to convene the conference. As a university, we are committed to providing a historical and social context to important issues, a view represented by today's panels examining international versus national policy perspectives and current and previous international campaigns. We're pleased to welcome representatives from the United Nations, the Canadian government, political think tanks, and a host of leading human rights organizations and NGOs. On behalf of UC Berkeley, I thank the distinguished participants for contributing their time and their good ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Provost Breslauer. I'd like to introduce next to make opening remarks the director of the Human Rights Center, Eric Stover. Eric is also adjunct professor of law and public health here at UC Berkeley. He's been active in the field of human rights for more than 25 years. Before coming to Berkeley in 1995, he served as executive director of Physicians for Human Rights and has continued to bring the innovations of scientific investigation to the human rights field. For more than a decade, he has gathered evidence of war crimes that were used in international tribunals to bring those responsible to justice. It was his inspiration to convene this international meeting of distinguished participants. Please join me in welcoming Eric Stover.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming. I'm never quite sure what opening remarks actually mean. So what I like to do best is write and tell stories in thinking about these ideas related to human rights. And so I want to tell you something that happened to me about 12 years ago, which, if you'll bear with me, is actually going to come to a point in the end. But it was exactly 12 years ago that I traveled to Rwanda on behalf of the International Criminal Court for Rwanda that had just been established. This was in March of 1995, so several months after the genocide. The chief prosecutor for the tribunal, Richard Goldstone, had asked if I would go in to Rwanda and conduct a mapping exercise and essentially travel throughout the country trying to find mass graves, which we knew were there. I had a colleague who went with me who was, also had worked with me in many other countries doing these forensic investigations of mass graves. We spent about 6 weeks there, and this is a very crude map as we went throughout the country. It got so frustrating at one point in Kigali, is the red mark here, because there were so many graves and so many bodies that had been, people who had been killed. We went up to Kabuye, you can see the red dots here and so on, and at certain points we used global GPS, global positioning systems to try and locate, mark where the graves were. The reason for doing this is the prosecutor were looking at suspects, and we wanted to start linking the physical evidence of the mass graves to these suspects so that they would be brought to trial. I can tell you it was about one of the worst 6 weeks I ever spent in my life. It chokes me up a little bit thinking about it. And one of the reasons for that, and my colleague actually had a nervous breakdown at one point on the trip. But the main reason for this was as we were traveling around, as we would come to villages, we would enter. There was nobody else around except for a few villagers and so on who would come out, and they often thought we were the press, or that we were actually an aid agency bringing food. And when we told them that we had actually come from this court that was going to investigate these crimes, there was kind of surprise. What court? And, you know, but what we found in many locations were that people had actually exhumed the graves and put them on platforms, the remains. In one village, they had stretched for the outside of Butare, which is where the university, national university is. They'd stretched it on a platform about the length of a football field, and it was in front of a school where children were playing outside, playing soccer. The reason they had done this is that they were so angry that the international community had not come, that aid agencies weren't there, that nobody helped them during the genocide. So I left. I filed my report. A forensic team came in, we went to the Kubuye site, we exhumed the grave, we presented the evidence in court, and one of the many accused who would go to trial, Clement Kayasema, was prosecuted and he was sentenced to life imprisonment for genocide. So some satisfaction that we were able to bring justice to this one town. But I will never forget is the fact that the people there were less interested, I think, in justice than trying to understand why we hadn't intervened. And it brings me to my point, and that is that my generation in the human rights movement, say in the 70s onwards, have really worked to try and end impunity, to try and establish truth commissions, to set up tribunals, in Eastern Europe, lustration programs, vetting programs, to recreate a sense of accountability and justice. But the one thing we didn't do, and that's important work, is we didn't move upstream. We weren't creative enough to start thinking about how do we protect people when they're at their most in danger. And I would submit to you that in this conference, that while we discuss what diplomacy can do, while we discuss what military can do as a last resort, what we need to do in creating laws and developing campaigns and so on around this issue, while we do this, we need to remember that there has to be a soul to this campaign, and I would submit that it is in the student movement. That's what inspired us to hold this conference, that if we're going to move this country and other countries to believe in this responsibility to protect, and it's going to be a hard sell, we're going to have a strong student movement. And it can't be a bi-coastal movement. It can't be just here in the West Coast and the East Coast. It's got to go into the heartland. And I think through the faith-based groups and religious organizations we can do this. So I think the challenge, and I hope there are a number of students here that will take this away, that as the responsibility to protect starts rolling on, and I really believe in my 24 years working in human rights that this has some real potential, we need to build a student movement around it. So I hope students here and others will join in that effort. Thank you and welcome again.
Thank you, Eric. Here to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, I'm delighted to welcome Darian Weltman-Swig to the stage. Darian is a board member of all three of our major conference partners, the Human Rights Center, Human Rights Watch, and Genocide Intervention Network, and she has been a tireless volunteer on behalf of this event, really showing great leadership in the steering committee and going to great lengths to make sure that the proceedings, starting from last night through a closed-door session tomorrow, will be successful. She's been immersed not only in the topics of human rights for many years, but specifically in the idea of the responsibility to protect. She completed a master's degree here at UC Berkeley last year, and that was the major topic of her investigation. So please join me in welcoming Darian Swig.
Steps up here. Thank you, Camille. I'm truly honored to have the opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker today. Gareth Evans and I met last fall at the Clinton Global Initiative, where I was in hot pursuit of him to secure him as our keynote speaker. Gareth was most gracious and promised he would clear his schedule to be here, and indeed he did. Because of my own work in the human rights field, I have known of Gareth's work and reputation for several years, and I can tell you that he is truly an extraordinary man. In addition to a long list of accomplishments, he is someone who cares deeply about this world and those who inhabit it. He works tirelessly towards ensuring the protection of all human beings and constantly reminds us that we are all bound together by a common humanity. As many of you know, Gareth is president and CEO of the International Crisis Group. It's based in Brussels. Under Gareth's guidance, the ICG is among the best in the world in giving policymakers at all levels insights into the complexities of conflict situations and best recommendations on how to approach them. Gareth has had a long and distinguished career. He is author of 8 books and has published over 90 book chapters, as well as copious newspaper, magazine, journal articles ranging from foreign relations to politics to legal reform. He was a member of Australia's Parliament for many years. He held 4 cabinet positions, most notably as Foreign Minister for 8 years. For those of us here today, we are most grateful for his intellectual contribution to and moral imprint on the creation of a humanitarian and holistic framework for approaching the world's conundrum of atrocity crimes often barricaded by sovereignty. Considered the architect of R2P, he served as a co-author of what is now considered the seminal work on the responsibility to protect. Among his other numerous commitments to advancing this solemn obligation, he also served as a member of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on threats, challenges, and change, whose report, A More Secure World, Our Shared Responsibility, was published in December 2004, and currently is a member of the UN Secretary General Advisories Committee on Genocide. In a recent speech given at the launch of the Stanford Program in International Policy Studies, that other university, Gareth offered the following insight on the evolution of the R2P doctrine. He reflected that in just 5 years, we have seen the emergence of what can reasonably be described as a brand new international norm of fundamental ethical importance. And Gareth, we could not agree with you more. As we come together over these 2 days to collectively build upon your early efforts to bring the rhetoric of the R2P into an international reality, we thank you for your unfailing direction and inspiration. You are a visionary of our time. You see the world not simply as it is, but how it ought to be. And someday, Gareth, thanks to your efforts and others, the responsibility to protect norm will be a universally accepted standard by which we measure all governments and hold them to account. And you will have launched this legacy of a new moral code on behalf of generations to come. We're delighted to have you here today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a warm welcome for the Honorable Gareth Evans.
Well, thank you, Darian, for that very generous and indeed richly undeserved introduction. Thank you all for the pleasure and the privilege of speaking to you, not least in the presence of one of my real personal heroes, Romeo Dallaire, and in the presence of so many other friends and colleagues from around this country and around the world who have been working to make the world a safer and a saner place. I do want to congratulate the Human Rights Centre and Eric Stover, Camille Crittenden, and all the co-sponsors and partners that have brought together all of us to create what is going to be, I think, a really terrific event, having a wide impact not only here on the West Coast, but indeed much further afield. I should say at the outset that it's always a particular pleasure for me to come back to Berkeley, because this place, in fact, constitutes something of a real milestone in my personal and political development. Back in 1964, about 20 years before most of you were born, I was invited by the US government, State Department, I think the CIA might have had something to do with it as well, to participate in something grandly called the Far East Asia Student Leader Project, which brought together a dozen or so campus student body presidents, of which I was one at Melbourne University at the time, to become acculturated and tamed, perhaps, by an experience of America. It was a wonderful trip, most of which was spent in a homestay in Lexington, Kentucky, and a campus stay in the University of Kalamazoo and the University of Western Michigan in Kalamazoo, as well as some of the bright lights. So far, so good from the organisers' perspective, but then they made, I'm afraid, a bit of a mistake, because we finished the tour with a couple of days here on the Berkeley campus. 1964, free speech movement, Sproul Hall, Mario Savio, freedom under Clark Kerr banners, but abbreviated with the initial letters only. And an atmosphere, as some of the more elderly academics among you will remember, probably no one else, a fantastic ferment and radical enlightenment. And of course that experience served to consolidate my personal movement from being a mildly progressive campus activist to be a fully fledged campus radical with a very, very sharp view of the wrongfulness, among other things, of the Vietnam War. So it was a real triumph, I guess, for public diplomacy and US foreign policy, but one that I vividly and warmly remember. It's great to be back here. Well, talking about making the world a saner place, let's cut straight to the chase. It's taken an insanely long time to come to terms with the idea that there is something fundamentally and intolerably wrong about states killing and forcibly displacing large numbers of their own citizens, or standing by while others do so. For centuries, going all the way back to the emergence of the modern system of sovereign states in the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, the view has prevailed that, to put it bluntly, sovereignty is a license to kill. That what happens within state borders, however grotesque, however morally indefensible, is nobody else's business. In the history of ideas, there have been some very bad ones indeed, and few more destructive over the centuries than this one. One would have thought that Hitler's Holocaust would have put paid to that notion once and for all, and certainly some major gains were made. Individual and group human rights were recognised in the new UN Charter, and more grandly, more explicitly in the Universal Declaration. And with the drafting of the Charter of the Nuremberg Tribunal in 1945, there did come the recognition in international law of the concept of crimes against humanity, which could be committed by a government against its own people and not necessarily just during wartime. But running alongside all this was this very clear continued recognition of the traditional view of state sovereignty. The language of the UN Charter says in Article 2.7 that nothing should authorise intervention in matters essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. The truth of the matter is that the UN founders were overwhelmingly preoccupied with the problem of states waging war against each other, and took unprecedented steps with the establishment of the Security Council and so on to limit their freedom of action in that respect. But notwithstanding all the genocidal horrors that had been inflicted during the Second World War, they showed no particular interest in the question of what constraints might be imposed on how states dealt with their own subjects. The state of mind that even massive atrocity crimes, like those of the Cambodian killing fields, were not the rest of the world's business, that state of mind prevailed really throughout the whole half-century, the first half-century of the UN's existence. Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia, which stopped the Khmer Rouge in its tracks, was universally attacked, not applauded. The traditional view of sovereignty as enabling absolute control of everything internal and demanding immunity from external intervention was, I have to say, very much reinforced by the large increase in UN membership during the decolonisation era. Those states who joined the UN during this period were all, of course, newly proud of their identity, conscious in many cases of their fragility, and generally saw the non-intervention norm as one of their few defences against threats and pressures from more powerful international actors seeking to promote their own economic and political interests. Not even the signing of the Genocide Convention of 1948 made much difference, despite its apparently explicit override of the non-intervention principle for that most extreme of all crimes against humanity. The coining of the word genocide by the legal scholar Raphael Lemkin in 1944, yoking together as he did the Greek noun for family, tribe or race and the Latin verb for massacre, was itself a very important development in the history of ideas. capturing some of that momentous quality of actions that are aimed not just at destroying individuals, but at whole national, racial, ethnic or religious groups, targeting, as Lemkin put it, the essential foundations of their life as such groups. But it was almost as if with the signing of the Genocide Convention, the task of addressing man-made atrocities was seen as complete. It took the major powers years, in the case of the United States, 40 years, to ratify the convention. It was rarely invoked and has never really been effectively applied to prevent or to punish actual atrocities. The US government's willingness to embrace the G word in the case of Darfur didn't, as we all know, make a cent's worth of difference when it came to taking more robust action in response. And the long-awaited test case in the International Court of Justice of Bosnia against Serbia, which was decided last month, concluding, as it did, that Serbia had not itself committed genocide, even in Srebrenica, though it did have some culpability for failing to prevent it, showed all too clearly what lawyers have long feared, that the legal definition of genocide in the Convention, requiring in particular very specific kinds of intent to be fully proved in relation to very specific kinds of groups precisely defined, is really just so narrow in scope that there are very few kinds of behaviour by either individuals or governments that will be caught by it. Well, with the arrival of the 1990s and the end of the Cold War, the prevailing complacent assumptions about non-intervention did at last come under challenge, as never before. The quintessential peace and security problem of the 90s became not interstate war, but civil war, and internal violence perpetrated on a massive scale. With the breakup of various Cold War state structures, most obviously in Yugoslavia, and the removal of some superpower constraints, conscience-shocking situations repeatedly arose. But old habits of non-intervention still died very hard, even when situations cried out for some kind of response. And the international community did react through the UN. It was too often erratically, incompletely, or counterproductively, as in the debacle of Somalia in '93, the catastrophe of Rwanda in '94, about which Romeo Dallaire and Eric Stover have spoken to us already so hauntingly and harrowingly, and the almost unbelievable default in Srebrenica just a year later in 1995. Then came Kosovo in 1999, when the international community did in fact militarily intervene, as it should have, but did so without the authority of the Security Council in the face of a threatened veto by Russia, therefore raising anxious questions about the integrity of the whole international security system. In response to these emerging situations, a powerful new idea did emerge and dominated international discourse throughout the 1990s, and this was the concept coined by the founder of Médecins Sans Frontières, Bernard Kouchner, of droit d'ingérence, the right to intervene, or more fully, the right of humanitarian intervention. But the trouble with this language is that while it was from many perspectives a noble and effective rallying cry, around the world it enraged as many as it inspired. Throughout the decade of the 90s, arguments about the right to intervene, mostly coming from the global north, were met by equally vehement claims, mostly from the global south, about the primacy and the continued resonance of the concept of national sovereignty. Battle lines were drawn, trenches were dug, verbal missiles flew. The debate was intense, it was very bitter, and the 1990s finished with it utterly unresolved in the UN or anywhere else. UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan at one stage made his own effort to resolve the conceptual impasse at the heart of this debate by arguing that national sovereignty had to be weighed and balanced in these cases against individual sovereignty, as recognised in the international human rights instruments. But this approach fell on deaf ears, being seen not so much as resolving the dilemma of intervention as simply restating it in different terms. In his report to the General Assembly in 2000, the Secretary-General brought the issue to a very public head, saying in language that was both moving and very agitated, and language which resonates to this day, If, he said, humanitarian intervention is indeed an unacceptable assault on sovereignty, how should we respond to a Rwanda, to a Srebrenica, to gross and systematic violations of human rights? Well, the task of meeting that challenge fell in the event to the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, ICIS for short, sponsored by the Canadian government, more particularly by its then rather far-sighted Foreign Minister, Lloyd Axworthy. I had the privilege of co-chairing that commission with the Algerian diplomat and veteran UN Africa advisor, Mohamed Sanoun, and we really did have an all-star cast to work with, including Ramesh Thakur, who's on this panel later this morning, and the US representative, for example, being Lee Hamilton, without whom these days no international panel of the great and the good could possibly be complete. The objectives of that commission, as we defined them to ourselves from the outset, were essentially threefold. To produce a guide to action on responses by the international community to internal man-made human rights violating catastrophe, which would be intellectually credible and satisfying, not profoundly offending either the lawyers or the philosophers, but more importantly, politically credible enough not to be rejected out of hand as a framework for action by either North or South, permanent 5 members of the Security Council, or any other major international constituency, and compelling enough in its basic message to be able in practice to actually motivate action and mobilise support when a situation demanding such a response arose. In the event, we made on that commission, I think it's fair to say, 4 main contributions to the international policy debate, which have been resonating ever since. The first, and perhaps ultimately the politically most useful, was to invent a whole new way of talking about humanitarian intervention. We sought to turn the whole weary debate about the right to intervene upside down, turn it on its head, and to recharacterise it as not as an argument about the right of states to do anything, but rather about their responsibility, one to protect people at grave risk. The relevant perspective, we argued, was not that of prospective interveners, but of those needing their support. The searchlight was swung back where it always should be, on the need to protect communities from mass killings and ethnic cleansing, women from systematic rape, children from starvation. The Commission's hope, and so far broadly our experience, has been that using responsibility to protect rather than right to intervene language would enable entrenched opponents to find new ground on which to more constructively engage. We very much had in mind the power of new ideas or old ideas newly expressed to actually change the behaviour of key policy actors. And a model we very much had in mind in this respect was the Brundtland Commission, which a few years earlier had introduced, you'll recall, the concept of sustainable development to bridge conceptually the huge gap which then existed between developers and environmentalists. With a new script, actors have to change their lines, and they do have to think afresh about what the real issues in the play actually are. The second contribution of the Commission, which was linked with that first one, and again conceptually significant, was to insist upon a new way of talking about sovereignty. We argued, building on an earlier formulation by Francis Deng, that the essence of sovereignty should now be seen not as control, as in the centuries-old Westphalian tradition, but rather, again, as responsibility. The starting point is that any state has the primary responsibility to protect the individuals within it, but that's not the finishing point. Where the state fails in that responsibility through either incapacity or ill will, a secondary responsibility to protect then falls on, shifts to the wider international community, and that, in a nutshell, is the core of the responsibility to protect idea. The third contribution of the Commission was to make it clear that the responsibility to protect was about much more than intervention, and in particular, about much more than just military intervention. Responsibility to protect extends to a whole continuum of obligations. Responsibility to prevent these situations arising, most important and most obvious of all in an ideal world, but most consistently neglected, I have to say, in the real one. The responsibility then to react to those situations when they did arise with a whole graduated menu of responses, starting with the persuasive and ending with the coercive. But then thirdly, the continuum extended, the responsibility to protect extends to rebuilding, the responsibility to rebuild a state after any such intrusive intervention. The remaining contribution of the Commission was to come up with guidelines for when the most extreme form of coercive reaction, military action, that's to say, would be appropriate. And that, I guess, is when the rubber really hits the road, if you want a morality-driven policy to have take-up in the real world, if you want idealism to be realistic. The first criterion was obviously legality, and here we saw our task as being not to try and find alternatives to the clear legal authority internationally of the Security Council, but rather to make the Security Council work better so there was less chance of the temptation arising to bypass it. But that was then followed by our articulation of 5 criteria of legitimacy, designed as a set of benchmarks which, while they might never guarantee consensus in any particular case, would hopefully make the achievement of consensus much more likely. And these 5 criteria, and I'll come back to them in a moment in another context, were in short the seriousness of the harm being threatened, the motivational primary purpose of the proposed military action, whether there were reasonably available peaceful alternatives, the proportionality of the response, and finally the balance of consequences, whether more good than harm would be done. Well, it's one thing to develop a concept like responsibility to protect, but it's quite another to get any policymaker to take any notice of it. I think the most interesting thing about the Responsibility to Protect report that we published at the end of 2001 is the way its central theme has continued to gain traction internationally, even though it almost suffocated at birth by being published in December 2001 in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 and by the massive international preoccupation with terrorism rather than internal human rights catastrophes which then began. But it is the case, and I'll say again what I said at Stanford, in which Darian so kindly quoted, in just 5 years, which is really a quite remarkably short time in the history of ideas, the Responsibility to Protect concept evolved from being just a gleam in a rather obscure international commission's eye to what now has the pedigree to be described as a broadly accepted international norm, and one which has the potential to further evolve into a rule of customary international law. On any view, that's an encouraging story, and we ought to be encouraged by it. The concept was first seriously embraced after our report was published in the doctrine of the newly emerging African Union. And over the next 2 to 3 years, it won quite a constituency among academic commentators and international lawyers. Normally, not a very exciting thing to do, but in this context, a not unimportant constituency, given that international law is the rather odd beast that it is, capable of evolving through practice and commentary, as well as through former treaty instruments. But the big step forward came with the UN's 60th anniversary World Summit in September 2005, which followed a major preparatory effort involving the report of the 2004 high-level panel on new security threats, of which I happen to be rather conveniently a member, which fed in turn into a major report by the Secretary-General himself. Both these documents emphatically embraced the Responsibility to Protect concept, and the summit outcome document, unanimously agreed by the more than 150 heads of state and government that were there present and meeting as the UN General Assembly, unambiguously picked up the core recommendations. The language was perhaps a little bit wordier and woollier than it needed to be, but it really was quite clear-cut in picking up the core theme of the original Canadian Commission report. The key words in that 2005 summit were these: each individual state has the responsibility to protect its populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity. We accept that responsibility and will act in accordance with it. The international community, through the United Nations, also has the responsibility to help to protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. In this context, we are prepared to take collective action in a timely and decisive manner through the Security Council, in accordance with the Charter, including Chapter 7, should peaceful means be inadequate and national authorities are manifestly failing to protect their populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity. That this endorsement happened was anything but inevitable. Not much else of real significance was actually agreed to by that summit, despite all the preparatory build-up and the very high expectations it had engendered. And a fierce rearguard action was fought almost to the last by a small group of developing countries, joined by Russia, which basically refused to concede any kind of limitation to the full and untramelled exercise of state sovereignty, however irresponsible the exercise of that sovereignty might be. What carried the day in the end was not so much consistent support from the EU and the US. That was there, but it was support which, after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, frankly, wasn't particularly helpful. The support that mattered, rather, was persistent advocacy by the sub-Saharan African countries, led by South Africa. In addition, a clear and historically really quite significant embrace of limited sovereignty principles by the key Latin American countries, and also some very effective last-minute personal diplomacy with majoring, wavering country leaders by the then Canadian Prime Minister Paul Martin. A further important conceptual development has occurred since the September 2005 summit, and that's been the adoption by the Security Council itself in April last year of a thematic resolution on the protection of civilians in armed conflict, which contains in an operative paragraph an express reaffirmation of the World Summit conclusions relating to responsibility to protect. And we've now begun to see that resolution in turn now being invoked, albeit more rhetorically rather than substantively, but invoked nonetheless in subsequent specific situations, as in particular with Resolution 1706 of last August on Darfur. A General Assembly resolution may be helpful, as the World Summit's unquestionably was, in identifying relevant principles, but the Security Council is the institution which matters when it comes to executive action, and at least a toehold there has now been carved. But this is just about where the good news ends. We simply can't be at all confident that the world will now respond quickly and effectively and appropriately to new human catastrophes as they arise, as the current case of Darfur is all too unhappily demonstrating. The responsibility to protect, R2P, has become a potentially powerful idea, but it will only be really powerful if it's implemented in practice. And there's a lot of unfinished business to attend to, falling from my perspective into four main categories. And I'll conclude by working my way through these issues. First bit of unfinished business is holding the line against backsliding. We can't, unfortunately, assume that the bridgehead that was achieved at the World Summit and in subsequent Security Council resolutions will necessarily hold. Some member states, particularly in Asia, were very reluctant to accept this part of the summit outcome document and continue to this day to fight a rearguard action against it. They've been much aided in this respect by what I call R2P's false friends, occasional efforts by defenders of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, notably the UK government, to paint it as justified by R2P principles, as other defences you'll recall in terms of possession of weapons of mass destruction and support for international terrorism crumbled away. Those efforts have not been remotely analytically persuasive, but they have succeeded admirably in reinforcing the arguments of R2P opponents that any concession as to the limits of state sovereignty would create an excuse that would be exploited all too willingly by neo-colonialists and neo-imperialists keen to return to their bad old habits of intervention of decades and centuries past. One sign of the possible difficulties ahead was the rejection in January this year, just a couple of months ago, by the Security Council, with vetoes from both China and Russia, cast together for the first time since 1972, and with South Africa, a new member of the Security Council, also voting against, a resolution condemning Myanmar, Burma's appalling human rights record. The argument of the opponents of that resolution was that the government's behaviour was not a threat to international peace, and thus it was outside the Security Council's jurisdiction. Well, it's certainly arguable that Burma's human rights violations, while deplorable, have not been of quite the same character or scale as those in Darfur or Kosovo or Srebrenica or Rwanda before it, and as such don't squarely raise R2P principles. But I have to say that it is disturbing, nonetheless, to see prevailing a narrow view of the scope of the Security Council's authority under the UN Charter, and the parallel return to favour of a broader view of the protection from international scrutiny and censure conferred by state sovereignty. As Desmond Tutu put it, if others are using the arguments we're using today when we ask them for their support against apartheid, we might still have been unfree. So those of us concerned to consolidate R2P as a universally accepted international norm, and one legitimising close attention by the Security Council toward the behaviour towards their own people of a number of deeply unsavoury regimes, we're all going to have to stay on our toes for a good while yet. Second piece of unfinished business, adopting guidelines for the use of military force. The Canadian Commission recognised that the issue of when it was right to fight, when it was right to use the most extreme of the options available to react to an R2P situation, this had to be specifically addressed if the idealism of the concept of international responsibility to protect was to be realistically applicable in practice. So we did all identify, as I've already mentioned and as Romeo mentioned last night, a set of prudential criteria which we argue should be adopted by the Security Council. These were, again, I'll spell them out in a little bit more detail, the seriousness of the harm being threatened, number one, which would need to involve, in the case of internal catastrophes, large-scale loss of life or ethnic cleansing to prima facie justify something as extreme as military action. Secondly, the motivation or primary purpose of the proposed military action, whether it was primarily to halt or avert the particular threat in question, or whether it had some other primary objective. Thirdly, whether there were reasonably available peaceful alternatives, and that doesn't mean that you have to ploddingly work your way through each one of those alternatives before moving rapidly to action if action is justified. It means simply that you have to make the judgment that lesser alternatives are not realistically or reasonably going to achieve the required result. Fourthly, the proportionality of the response, which speaks for itself. And fifthly, very importantly, the balance of consequences, whether overall more good than harm would be done by a military invasion. Well, these recommendations were originally by the Canadian Commission. They were subsequently embraced by both the high-level panel and the Secretary-General in his own report to the 2005 World Summit. But they weren't adopted by it, and they remain in limbo. Of course, no criteria of the kind that the Commission argued for, even if agreed as guidelines by the Security Council, will ever end argument on how they should be applied in particular circumstances. For example, Darfur right now, and I'm happy to address that issue in question time if you want me to further pursue it. But it's hard to believe that those criteria, if adopted, would not be more helpful than the present totally ad hoc system in focusing attention to the relevant issues, revealing weaknesses in argument, and generally encouraging consensus. The third piece of unfinished business is building available capacity. If R2P is not to remain more theoretical than real, we must somehow solve the problem of capacity, ensuring that the right civilian and, as necessary, military resources are always there in the right amounts and with the appropriate capability. The experience of the current African Union mission in Darfur is a classic demonstration of this problem. Too few troops, too poorly equipped, too immobile to perform effectively, even the limited civilian protection task required by their present mandate. The UN is currently feeling desperately overstretched, with over 80,000 military and 15,000 civilian personnel now deployed worldwide. But with the world's armed services still currently absorbing some 20 million men and women in uniform, with another 50 million reservists and 11 million paramilitaries, it hardly seems beyond the wit of mankind to work out a way of making some of that capacity available when and where it's needed to prevent and react to man-made catastrophe. Another crucial practical operational issue is to address the question, up until now almost completely neglected by the world's militaries, but thankfully not by the world's thinkers, and Victoria Holt has written a superb book on this subject, and she's here with us at this conference. And this is the problem of developing detailed concepts of these R2P or civilian protection operations, which do involve neither traditional war fighting, where the object is not to stop violence as such, but to defeat an enemy, and on the other hand, peacekeeping operations, which although these days usually involve much more than the traditional passive monitoring, have still not come to grips, as Romeo Dallaire was making the point very clearly last night, have not come to grips with the kind of responses needed to cope with the threat or the reality of atrocity crimes. It's not just a matter of force configuration, but of developing new doctrine and new kinds of rules of engagement and new kinds of training. And the final piece of unfinished business, generating the political will to act. As always, this is the biggest and hardest piece of the puzzle. But we have to recognise that finding the necessary political will to do anything hard or anything expensive or anything politically sensitive or anything seen as not directly relevant to national interests is just a given in public affairs, domestically or internationally. The absence of political will should not be a matter for lamentation, but of mobilisation. Political will is not hiding there in a cupboard or under a stone somewhere waiting to be discovered. It has to be painstakingly built. And all of us do have a role in this respect. Not only those occupying the commanding heights of policy making and decision making, but as has been said already very effectively by Romeo last night, by Eric again this morning, it's the kind of academics and intellectuals and NGOs and ordinary citizens who have been brought together today here in Berkeley and can be brought together and can be mobilised around the world. In mobilising the necessary political will from all the vast range of political actors that have to be mobilised in this respect, both at the national level and at the international, intergovernmental level, the key is not just to have good organisation and good lobbying techniques and good contacts, but it really is also to have good arguments, intelligently and energetically advanced. Those arguments may, at one level, be simply party interest arguments designed to consolidate a government's vocal domestic base. And that's always been an important element in the Bush administration's interest in Sudan, such as it's been. There's national interest arguments, of course, much easier to make now in relation to quarrels in faraway countries between people of whom we know nothing, in Chamberlain's familiar terms, because of what we do know now about the capacity of failed and failing states in this globalised world to be a source of havoc for others. There are financial arguments in terms of $1 million of preventive action now, saving $1 billion worth of military intervention and clean-up costs later. And, at the end of the day, there is also a category of moral arguments, given that however base politicians' real motives may be, they always do rather like to be seen to be acting from higher ones. We can, if we need to, always justify making R2P a reality on hard-headed, practical, national interest grounds, on the basis that states that can't or won't stop internal atrocity crimes are exactly the kind of rogue states or failed states or failing states that can't or won't stop terrorism or weapons proliferation or drug and people trafficking, the spread of health pandemics and other global risks. But at the end of the day, the case before the responsibility to protect rests simply on our common humanity. The impossibility of ignoring the cries of pain and distress of our fellow human beings. For any of us in and around the international community, from individuals to NGOs, to national governments, to international organisations, to yet again ignore that distress and agony, and to once again make never again a cry that rings emptily, is to diminish that common humanity to the point of despair. We should be united in our determination to not let that happen, and there's no greater or nobler cause on which any of us could be embarked. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gareth. That was a really wonderful and inspiring speech. We have time for a few questions, and I would ask that you either speak up very well, or we also have a microphone, a handheld microphone available in the back. This event is being webcast, and so it would be very helpful for others who are going to listen to it if you could be very loud and articulate.
James Smith from the English Trust. Thank you again for the remarkable work that you've done to change international law and more difficult to movements of different people. My question is about Darfur. Senator Laird last night reminded us that there's no contingency planning by any governments for even intervention along the borders of Darfur. I'm wondering, in your view, how much of this is a function of governments wanting to pursue other peaceful means to consider the balance of consequences of good versus harm, and how much of this is really a function of the lack of appetite for political will in sub-Saharan Africa?
I think it's disgraceful that such contingency planning is not occurring, and one of the things that the International Crisis Group has been advocating for quite some time is that just that do happen, because that in itself would send a very compelling message to the regime in Khartoum, which has shown itself conspicuously unwilling to be at all responsive to any of the rather minimal pressure that's been put upon it so far. The problem of actual military intervention is twofold. Obviously, there's a huge problem of engagement, commitment, will, and as was said last night, there's no evidence anywhere in the world that anyone is in the slightest bit interested in going in there on a non-consensual, coercive basis, although there is significant interest in significantly reinforcing the current African Union contingent to bring it up to about 3 times its present strength, which would be extraordinarily helpful in advancing the civilian protection mandate. But the second problem is a conceptual problem which we ought to recognise before we get too exuberant in our argument for military intervention and too engaged in the political campaign of generating support for it. And that is, it is a real issue. It is a real issue as to whether all the criteria for military intervention have here been satisfied. Not the 5 I listed, I guess the 2 that most immediately spring to mind are the question of last resort, whether all reasonable alternatives to military action have in fact been exhausted, and secondly, the balance of consequences. As to exhausting alternatives, the truth of the matter is that there's every reason to believe that the effective application of a whole series of measures which have already indeed been flagged by the Security Council but not applied in terms of economic sanctions, economic pressure, would make a hell of a difference to the Khartoum regime. At the moment, it's been a bit like that scene from Monty Python. One of these days we'll do something, and absolutely nothing is ever actually done. But if a much wider range of individuals had been targeted with the personal sanctions, the travel bans, the international account bans on how they could use their money, if some serious economic measures were brought to bear, not just on the oil sector, but on those businesses which we know have played a very significant part in fueling the resources of the present regime, if some serious effort were made by the US government to apply the banking restrictions, which it's so enthusiastically rushing around now applying against the Palestinians trying to put together a unity government, and indeed in the context of Iran, the context of North Korea, we know how those things work, and they are fantastically effective, much more so than the old trade sanctions. If any effort of this kind were made, we really would be doing a lot more to change the balance of risk assessment so far as the Khartoum government is concerned, and really put some pressure on them. There's another form of activity which falls short of full-scale, non-consensual, on-the-ground military invasion, and that is a no-fly zone, which of course does raise sovereignty issues, because if you're serious about a no-fly zone, you've got to be prepared to actually zap something that's infringing that particular no-fly prescription. But it's a much more limited form of intervention, and it's one, again, that the Security Council has itself flagged as being a possible source of response. That hasn't happened either. So until, given the difficulty in the real world of actually mobilising support for a non-consensual invasion, it is very, very sensible to think in terms of upping the pressure in all those ways that I've mentioned. The divestment strategy has been a very important one, and initiated, I think, here on this campus, among others around the States. And pressure of this kind, building up on individual firms, but better still on governments themselves, to inhibit this sort of response would be hugely important. But then there does remain this other issue, the balance of consequences, and whether it really does make sense to talk about military intervention. It has to be said that Darfur is a much more complex situation than Rwanda ever was. For a start, there's actually a set of opponents on the ground, the rebel movements that did actually initiate the original conflict, to which Khartoum catastrophically overreacted, but nonetheless are still there playing their part in keeping the conflict and the risk going for civilian populations. But the real issue is, if a big brigade went in there, if logistically it could be put together and if logistically it was doable, what nonetheless would the consequences be? Would they be to the net benefit of the people of Darfur and Sudan generally? Or would the, as so obviously happened in Iraq in 2003, would the downside risks outweigh any possible benefit? And here it's a very close judgment indeed that is involved, because there are two forms of risk in particular that have to be weighed in the balance. One is the risk that any form of coercive military intervention would make impossible the work of the humanitarian relief organisations on the ground, that such limited cooperation as they have, and it's very limited, from the Sudan government would evaporate, the logistical problems of supply routes and so on would be impossible to overcome, and basically they would up stakes and leave, which would be catastrophic in terms of the suffering that would incur for those huge numbers of displaced people in the camps and elsewhere, nearly 2 million of them at the moment. And that has to be weighed in the balance, and the views of those organisations has to be taken very closely into account. And the other issue is the impact of any such coercive intervention on the North-South peace agreement, which some of us have forgotten went on for 20 years, that particular war, and was huge in terms of the number of casualties, the mortality rate, the absolute disaster that represented. And there is certainly reason to believe that that peace agreement is only hanging by a thread at the moment, and any such enterprise of this kind by the international community would in fact lead to its really immediate collapse, almost certainly the withdrawal of the existing UN force, or them being forced out, because that's there on a completely different mandate than a coercive one. And so it's a tough call. But the balance is actually changing, I think, towards this. One of the reasons we used to cite for the unreality of a military coercion would be the likely response of the Sudan military, and the sort of catastrophic scale of the conflict that would thus be generated by it. We've seen a very limp performance by the Sudan military in dealing with the rebel movements and so on in recent months, and probably the kind of resistance one would get from the National Army would not be in itself reason to not be prepared to go in there. But you do have to work your way through those issues before you can come to any kind of confident conclusion that now is the time for military intervention. But my final word on this is, this doesn't mean, as some people have rather cynically said, that, well, so much for R2P, so much for the responsibility to protect. It's absolutely nonsense to think of it that way. Responsibility to protect, much broader concept: prevention, reaction, rebuilding, and even within the reaction part of the spectrum of response, responsibility to protect means that the internationals, when the domestic players fail, as they so obviously have here, the range of responses, from the persuasive through to the coercive, has to be appropriately tailored to the circumstances, and that's indeed what the whole business of criteria and so on is about. You're still exercising responsibility to protect if you're applying sanctions and really putting the screws on these guys and doing everything that's realistically available to achieve a result. It's not an abdication, it's an application of the principle, and don't let's forget that. That was a rather long-winded answer, but I'm sure others want to come at the Darfur thing in many ways, so that sort of wraps it all up, but we can come again. Yeah. Do you want me to just field this?
Sure.
Okay. Unless you know some people who I should never ask.
No, please, just take the microphone.
My name is Jamie Rowan. I'm from Holt Hall, previously Consulate. My question regards these three elements of responsibility to protect.
Yeah.
The responsibility to prevent, react, and rebuild. And most of the talk, and I think what the movement has been, is the responsibility to prevent and react as it was being implemented. And I want to question what's happening with the responsibility to rebuild. And when I think about sort of cases, the responsibility to rebuild is actually quite goes hand in hand with the responsibility to prevent in cases, for example, like Bosnia, where the lack of efforts to rebuild are fomenting additional activities that eventually lead to more violence.
That's a very good question, and I think you've given part of the answer in your response. I think we need to think of conflict prevention as not just kind of a ladder starting with long-term structural measures and then working your way up as a situation deteriorates to shorter-term measures, then intervention and then response, and finally you get to the top of the ladder and look around saying that's terrific and then it'll all go. Well, it's not like that. It's a cycle. It's a cycle. And you start with, the need for long-term preventive measures in a situation which has never been exposed to conflict, whether those measures be social and economic policy or political and legal or constitutional, or whether they be military in the form of civilian to military, military to civilian reconstruction and so on. You have all those strategies available. As you move around the conflict cycle, get into conflict, then get out of it through negotiation or military response, you move into the peace building, the post-conflict peace building part of it. And that, again, as you just indicated, is as much a preventive exercise to get that right as the first part of the cycle was, because we know better than any other piece of acquired knowledge over the last 15 years that the best single indicator of future conflict is past conflict. The best way to guarantee that there'll be another major catastrophe internally is to not properly attend to all the loose ends that are left after the last catastrophe. And when we think that Rwanda itself in '94 was the product of a failed Arusha agreement a little earlier, that the 20 years of, or the extra 10 years of civil war that was experienced in the Congo, catastrophic human loss, was the product of a failed Bekes peace agreement. The situation in Haiti was the product of a failed international follow-through. It's critically important to see peace building, post-conflict peace building, as itself a conflict prevention measure. And here I think the news is much better about the international community's response than we tend to acknowledge on occasions like this. The penny has finally dropped. Light has dawned that getting it right after conflicts is absolutely critical, and indeed it's probably, of all the preventive strategies available, it's probably the highest priority. And one of the other small things that was done at the World Summit in 2005 was to endorse the creation of a new peace-building commission, which has worked much better on paper so far than it has in practice, but nonetheless reflects that understanding and that commitment. Other preventive strategies, and there's a million of them, and what's in the toolbox depends really entirely on case-by-case evaluation and which stage in the conflict or potential conflict cycle the country is at, and what kind of response is appropriate at each stage to get prevention going. The range of measures that's available for this is so wide, it's almost impossible to generalise about how effective sort of the international response has been. But again, I think it's fair to say that there's a lot more intelligent understanding of these issues now as a result of the experience of the post-Cold War years than was the case before. We do have really quite effective early warning mechanisms. We do have aid agencies throughout the world now understanding that their obligation is not just traditional poverty alleviation, but it's hugely to do with conflict prevention, better governance, better internal systems, better ways of addressing accumulating grievances and so on. And within governments, many governments around the world, you've got a mainstreaming of conflict prevention, you've got specific agencies within governments that are thinking hard about how to respond in advance to these particular situations. So the news is not all bad. And in fact, it's reflected in the conflict statistics that have emerged. The Human Rights Centre at the University of British Columbia has published this Human Security Report, which some of you may not be familiar with, but it's eminently worth looking at. Back 2 years ago, and the updated version has just come out a few weeks ago, which does in fact very clearly statistically establish that the number of conflicts, and indeed the number of large-scale internal human rights catastrophes, massacres and genocides and so on, has in fact dramatically deteriorated. Something like 80% less now of these things happening, and 80% less of casualties occurring, violent deaths occurring, than was the case just 15 or 16 years ago. And that's attributable a hell of a lot to better peacemaking, negotiation, intervention type strategies, peacekeeping, but also to generally much more effective preventive strategies, early response strategies, and post-conflict peace-building strategy. We've got a gigantic distance to go before we can even begin to be complacent about this. We can't possibly. But it's encouraging, I think, to know that a lot of effort has been put in, and effort really does make a difference. There's nothing worse in this business than feeling that whatever you do, there's just an endless cycle of violence out there which is going to go on happening come what may. That's not true. Active, energetic, focused commitment behaviour really does make a difference. Yep. So, I'm sorry.
My question is about what you were speaking about concerning political will and how what kind of reforms we make. Are they within the private sector, for instance, when you're talking about trying to get states which have like corporate interests, or states like China that have oil interests in a country like Sudan? Is it the private sector that regulates those interests and changes them, or is it supposed to come from the state in saying like we're not going to participate in this sort of conquest in terms of like oil or resources or labor?
Well, relevant political pressure to generate political will can be mobilised at all sorts of levels and have an impact at all sorts of levels. There's no single answer to that question. Peer group pressure from states in international organisations, human rights councils, the UN General Assembly, Security Council, regional bodies in particular, peer group pressure can be fantastically important in concentrating the minds of recalcitrant states on better behaviour. Even in the case of China and Darfur, where it does obviously have oil interests, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that China has been increasingly concerned, and I know because I've talked to the Chinese in Beijing and in New York and elsewhere, they've been increasingly concerned about the way they've been fingered over and over again in international debate by NGOs, by community organisations, and indeed by a number of states themselves, by saying they're putting their economic, their commercial interests ahead of humanitarian interests and decency interests. And they don't like, no state, however confident a state may be, you can't find states around the world much more confident than China at the moment, they don't like that kind of finger pointing, and they wriggle. And what's been happening is that China has been putting a fair amount of private pressure. You'll never get the Chinese to publicly acknowledge the legitimacy of intervention and so on of a more robust kind. But they certainly, to my knowledge, in the behind-the-scenes stuff that's been going on, have been much more anxious to get the message across to Bashir than was the case even just a year or two ago, that something has to change. I fear that that by itself is not going to make much difference to Bashir. You are going to need all those other measures being put in place, the economic disincentives and the threat, ultimately, of more robust intervention. But that and that makes us stop and think. The fact that states internationally can point the finger at others, they don't do that out of a clear blue sky. They only do it because they feel that there's some kind of consensus building up from below. In terms of, which is what makes NGO action, community action, so relevant, because that does work its way through, ultimately, all levels of the system. So I don't think we ought to be dispirited about the scale of the task ahead. The important thing to realise is that it's not just, sort of shouting that makes a difference in the way in which governments react. You do have to accompany the shouting with good, rigorous, tough-minded argument about what will actually work. And one of the things that I found a little bit dispiriting is the millions and millions of dollars that have now been spent by the Save Darfur Coalition on sort of full-page newspaper ads and so on, telling a very simple story about, this must end, this horror must end, and somebody must do something. but it hasn't really been accompanied by much detailed agitation on the particular kinds of strategies that might be workable and might move the thing forward. And that's really where we have to put our effort, not just generalised consciousness raising, but a lot of the more specific stuff as well. But again, I'm sorry, there's no simple and short answer to what you're saying, but I think corporates generally around the world are feeling the heat much more than they used to about their kind of irrelevance to the political scene. They know now that there are domestic constituencies all around this globe that are watching very closely their performance, their behaviour, their degree of cooperation with ugly regimes and so on. And it's very important to keep those messages out there as well. Because at the end of the day, this sort of economic incentive stuff is probably the best guarantor of change of political heart by governments that need to change their position. There's a lot of other motives that are relevant too, but that's the one that does unquestionably tend to concentrate their attention. Well, time for one or two more? That's it. Sorry, over to you.
I'm sorry to cut this very interesting conversation and question and answer short. I would just like to encourage you to hold your questions. Perhaps Mr. Evans could answer them privately as we're standing around at the breaks. I'd like to take just a brief break now before we assemble our panel here at 10:30. So join me in thanking Gareth Evans once more.